Imagine a continent where nearly 600 million people are still living without access to electricity, and close to 1 billion rely on traditional biofuels for cooking. This is the harsh reality of Africa, a continent that is extremely vulnerable to climate change, despite contributing less than 5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions over the past 170 years. The second Africa Climate Summit, set to take place in Ethiopia in September, aims to address this pressing issue by bringing African countries together to demand a fairer deal on phasing out fossil fuels and mobilizing funds to support the transition to renewable energy. But here's where it gets controversial. Many African countries continue to rely heavily on coal, oil, and gas, with solar energy accounting for a mere 3% of electricity generation. In fact, renewable energy currently supplies only 24.1% of Africa's electricity, with 76% of this coming from hydropower, a source that is increasingly being affected by climate change. And this is the part most people miss. Collectively, African countries need between $1.6 trillion and $1.9 trillion by 2030 to move away from fossil fuels. But the current climate finance available is often provided as loans rather than grants, leaving the continent in debt. About 751 million Africans are negatively affected by their governments spending money on repaying high-interest external debt, instead of investing in climate resilience and sustainable development. The World Bank and African Development Bank's recent Mission 300 project aims to connect 300 million people in Africa to electricity by 2030. But this will still leave another 300 million behind. The 2023 Global COP28 Climate Conference pledged to triple the amount invested in global renewable energy. But as Africa currently only receives about 4% of global climate investment, tripling this amount will not make much difference. For this reason, the continent needs its own climate summit to bring African countries together to demand fair global responses, including greenhouse emissions cuts from high-emitting countries in the developed world. The summit will mobilize for finance and new technologies that are needed for Africa to combat climate change. Without its own climate summit, Africa runs the risk of being sidelined in a crisis it did not cause. The first summit, which took place in 2023, issued the Nairobi Declaration, which agreed that African countries must reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030. It called for the long overdue delivery of the world's $100 billion annual climate finance pledge and advocated for a fair phase-down of unabated coal and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. African countries pledged a 5-fold increase to funding for new renewable energy systems and committed to setting up green industries, climate-aligned trade, and financial system reform. But what did this really achieve? Progress since the summit remains largely unknown, with no progress reports and unmeasured promises. However, some programs like the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative have been launched, aiming to drive green industrialization on the continent. The Continental Circular Economy Action Plan was also launched in July 2025, aiming to create green jobs, empower youth and women, and position Africa as a global leader in climate-resilient, inclusive growth. The 2025 summit has 6 agenda items: reimagining climate finance and investment architecture, accelerating renewable energy and technological transformation, scaling nature-based and community-led solutions, strengthening strategic governance and global partnerships, harnessing critical minerals for green industrialization and a just energy transition, and advancing regional implementation mechanisms. These discussions will center on easier lending terms, restructured debt, and funding national projects using domestic currencies. The summit also wants easier access to climate finance and will discuss ways to get electricity to the 600 million Africans without power by 2030. But here's the question. Can Africa really achieve its climate goals without a significant increase in global climate investment? The answer is unclear. But one thing is certain: the continent needs a fairer deal on phasing out fossil fuels and mobilizing funds to support the transition to renewable energy. And this is where you come in. What do you think is the most pressing climate issue facing Africa today? Do you think the continent can achieve its climate goals without a significant increase in global climate investment? Share your thoughts in the comments below.